August 12, 1940, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. He woke before the bugle because the air in the barracks felt unfamiliar, a soft heat that smelled of pine wood and laundry soap, and because the single ceiling fan turned through the night with an easy rhythm he had never known in Germany since the blackout orders. Oberleutnant Karl Weber lay still and listened to the sounds that marked his new life, the scrape of boots on plank floors, the clink of enamel mugs, the low voices that drifted it in German and faintly from the guard walk in English. He had arrived 2 days earlier by train from Norfolk after a long voyage across the Atlantic in a Liberty ship that ran with a precision he could not reconcile with the stories he had believed. He had kept a small diary since the France campaign, a habit formed in a quieter time, and in it on the evening of August 10th, he had written a single sentence, simple and almost without feeling. We were put in wooden barracks with electric light in each room. He lit the bulb at his bunk and watched the filament glow, steady and bright, until the guard told him gently to sleep. In the morning, he queued for coffee that tasted like the memory of a city cafe in Cologne before the war, and a slice of white bread that broke cleanly under his fingers. He felt a kind of shame that he ate so eagerly, and he refused a second slice, then accepted it and ate that as well. When the American sergeant at the mess door said, "University men form on the left," Weber turned his head, as if the words belonged to someone else. He had studied law at Bonn before the officer school. He had taken 2 seminars in Roman legal history. He could still hear the voice of his old professor in the vaulted lecture room. He stepped to the left with a quiet nod, and the sergeant placed his name on a list, then said that a representative of Louisiana Polytechnic Institute would come to the compound on Thursday to discuss courses in English, mathematics, and American government. Weber walked back to the barracks with the paper slip in his hand and the sunlight pressing white on the path, and he felt a strange calm. He was a prisoner, yet he sensed that a door had opened that did not exist a week earlier, when he stood on a French quay with his hands raised and the smell of diesel in the air. Across the United States in 1943, the prisoner of war program had grown into a network that reached from Maine to California, with more than 170 main camps and hundreds of branch camps that fed labor into farms, lumber mills, and canneries, and that also built classrooms inside the wire. By the end of that year, the Provost Marshal General's office, through a unit known as the Special Projects Division, had recorded tens of thousands of enrollments in courses run by camp education officers and by faculty from nearby colleges. Extension divisions from state universities sent textbooks and syllabi, and in some cases, professors crossed the guard lines to teach face-to-face. Diaries from Camp Aliceville in Alabama and Camp Hearn in Texas describe blackboards set up between rows of bunks, vocabulary lists pinned to mess hall walls, and lectures delivered by men who had fled Europe in the 30s and now returned to speak to Germans in their own language about literature, economics, and the structure of a free press. In Rhode Island, at Fort Kearny, a group of anti-Nazi prisoners printed a newspaper that argued for a democratic Germany after the war, and the fact that they could do so under the eyes of American officers spoke to a policy that sought not only to confine, but to educate. Many of these courses carried real academic weight. The University of Nebraska, the University of Kansas, and other institutions accepted registrations for correspondence study that would be counted after repatriation. Reports submitted to Washington in the winter of 1943 recorded more than 40,000 prisoners in structured classes, and that number would rise in 1944 as labor demand pulled men out by day and sent them back to books at night. The scale sat within a larger scale. This was the same country that was launching ships at a rate of 3 a day, that was moving grain by barge in volumes greater than the German harvest of 1942, that was running steel in furnaces that did not cool between shifts. The educational effort could exist only because the infrastructure to supply paper, chalk, lights, and even spare classrooms inside wooden barracks existed in abundance. The numbers made a kind of map of intent. In the same months that American forces fought on the beaches of Sicily and later in Italy, camp officers ordered thousands of English prématres, hundreds of classroom benches, and cartons of dictionaries. In Weber's barracks, men joked that the Americans would try to turn them into professors, and then fell silent as the lights came on for evening study and the sound of pages turning filled the long room. On that Thursday afternoon, Weber stood with 30 other officers under the shade of a pine as 2 civilian men in shirt sleeves entered with an American captain. The older civilian introduced himself as a professor from Louisiana Polytechnic Institute in Ruston. He spoke slowly in English at first, "Welcome to our town," then shifted into careful German and said that the institute would offer classes inside the camp and that prisoners who showed interest and discipline would be invited to attend supervised sessions in a lecture room on campus once a week, under guard and within the rules of the Geneva Convention. The word invited moved through the group like a quiet wind. A lieutenant beside Weber whispered that this must be a trick, that they would be asked to sign something. The professor smiled as if he had heard this many times, and he held up a thin booklet in German that explained the course structure and the fact that no political test would be required for language or mathematics. The captain confirmed that the first escorted visit to the campus would take place in 2 weeks, limited to 10 men, and that all instruction would be academic, with no questions on military topics. That evening, Weber wrote a letter home, careful and formal as the censors would read it, and he chose each word with restraint. "The Americans have offered us classes with professors from the town," he wrote. "I will try to improve my English and perhaps learn something of their legal system. It is strange to write this while the wire is right outside the window." He folded the letter and placed it on the pile near the mess entrance. Over the following days, the camp made small adjustments for the new term. A storeroom became a library with shelves of donated books, English on one side, German classics on the other. An older master sergeant who had taught school before the war sorted exercise books into neat stacks. A notice went up with the hour for a lecture titled "The Constitution of the United States as a Framework of Government." When the first campus day came, 10 men, Weber among them, marched to a truck at 7 in the morning, each with a guard at his side and a second guard on the tailgate with a carbine across his knees. The road into town ran past a water tower and red brick buildings and a line of parked cars that astonished them by number alone. The campus itself was not large, but the green lawn, the shaded walks, and the low talk of students moving between classes cut into Weber's doubts more cleanly than any pamphlet could have done. He noted the ease with which young women and men addressed the faculty, the way they held books close to their chests, and the gentle pride with which the professor led them into a lecture room that smelled of chalk, wood, and the faint sweetness of paper. Here, he thought, the war felt like a distant storm. The professor began by writing the word citizenship on the board, then spoke in English and translated into German, and in those alternations Weber felt a bridge forming that did not erase what he had believed, but that asked him to examine those beliefs with tools he had not been given before. That day at Ruston existed within a larger movement that touched many camps. In Texas, the camp at Hearn arranged for faculty from Texas A and M to visit and speak on agriculture and soil conservation, practical subjects that aligned with the labor the prisoners provided in the fields. In Alabama, Aliceville built music programs with the help of local teachers, and the camp orchestra played works by Beethoven and Brahms for townspeople invited to listen from outside the wire. In Nebraska, the state university's extension service processed hundreds of enrollments for courses in English composition, American history, physics, and commerce, and the paperwork traveled by mail bags that still smelled faintly of the wheat the same trains carried. The emphasis was not on indoctrination, as the records from the Special Projects Division stress, but on exposure to the methods and habits of a society that ran on laws, open debate, and the steady practice of civic life. A German prisoner at Camp Grant in Illinois wrote in his diary in January 1944 that the Americans allow us to read newspapers that criticize their own leaders, and that this shocks the mind at first, but then it trains the eye to weigh claims rather than to fear them. At Fort Kearny, the newspaper Der Ruf took shape under the guidance of editors who had broken with the regime, and its pages argued for a Germany that would return to the rule of law. Circulation rose into the thousands inside the camp system, and when repatriation came, several of those editors would continue their work in the new Federal Republic. The schools inside the wire did not bestow degrees, yet a path formed from those benches to real diplomas. American universities kept records, and after the war, many former prisoners wrote to request transcripts. Some were later admitted to programs in Europe that honored the study they had begun under guard. Numbers give the shape of this without embellishment. By mid-1944, more than 40,000 prisoners were in classes. More than 100 camp newspapers appeared at one time or another, and in a single month, the Army reported the distribution of thousands of textbooks through the program. Against this, the world outside the camps moved through harsh arithmetic. In the summer of 1943, shipping losses declined as escort carriers and long-range patrol bombers closed the mid-Atlantic gap, and American factories reached peaks that would not be matched again for decades. While in Europe, cities burned under bombing that cut into the power grid and rail lines that fed the German war economy. The contrast was not drawn out of cruelty in the classroom. It existed as a condition of the place, and men like Weber felt it in the hum of a campus generator, as surely as in the easy availability of chalk and paper. That hum became part of his memory of the first lecture, and later, when he lay in his bunk and listened to the fan, he matched their rhythms. By late August 1943, The lectures had become a steady rhythm in Karl Weber's captivity. The truck came each Thursday at dawn, and he took his place with the same group of 9 men, each carrying a notebook and pencil. They passed through the small Louisiana town where shopkeepers already opened shutters and children walked to school. The guards remained alert but relaxed, for in the months since the first transfer, there had not been a single escape attempt from any of the university study groups across the South. Weber noticed that the townspeople no longer stared at the prisoners as curiosities. The sight of Germans riding in an army truck on their way to class had become part of the normal order. When they reached the campus, the smell of freshly cut grass mixed with the diesel fumes of the vehicle, and the sound of a bell drifted across the quad, inside the same lecture room as before. The professor began with a review of last week's discussion on the United States Constitution, drawing diagram of federal and state powers. Weber listened carefully, his English improving, and noted in his book, "The Americans separate authority to limit power." After the lecture, the professor invited questions. A former engineer asked why a country so large could govern without a single directive center. The professor answered, "Because every man here is expected to take responsibility for his own actions." Weber wrote that down too. It struck him that this idea, simple as it was, explained the unshakable confidence he had sensed in everyone he met. When the class ended, the guards escorted them to a small library. Rows of wooden shelves held American and German texts side by side. Weber pulled down a translation of Tocqueville and ran his hand along the page as though touching the key to a locked door. That evening, back at Camp Ruston, he sat on his bunk while the fan turned slowly above and wrote, "We are learning how they think, and perhaps why they have so much." Beyond Camp Ruston, the policy that allowed such instruction had begun to spread. In Washington, the War Department's Special Projects Division, established under the Provost Marshal General, received favorable reports from regional inspectors, noting that education kept morale stable and reduced disciplinary problems. The division's head, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, a literary scholar before the war, drafted guidelines that called education the moral rehabilitation of the enemy through exposure to democratic process. It was not merely charity. The United States understood that it would one day have to rebuild the nations it now fought. Across the country, universities partnered with nearby camps. The University of Wisconsin sent correspondence packets to Camp McCoy containing English texts and arithmetic problems. The University of Michigan's Extension Program dispatched printed lessons to the Upper Peninsula camps holding captured Luftwaffe crews. By early 1944, more than 70 American universities were involved in some form of instruction for German prisoners, a fact remarkable when the country was still at war. Reports compiled by the Army Education Service listed over 40,000 prisoners attending classes in language, science, agriculture, and civics. There were even small cultural exchanges. Professors brought gramophones and records of symphonies, and some prisoners performed German art songs in appreciation. The atmosphere of mutual observation prevailed. Americans saw disciplined soldiers turning into students, while prisoners witnessed the organization of a society that could fight a total war and yet spare resources for books. For men like Weber, this contrast was impossible to ignore. He wrote to his sister that America wins because it builds while it fights, because it believes that even enemies may learn. In the winter of 1943, Weber's group was invited to participate in a series of debates organized jointly by camp officers and faculty. The topic for the first was whether democracy could survive in wartime. The prisoners sat at one table, the American students at another, the guards standing by the doors. Weber spoke after a long silence, careful with his English, saying that in his country war had always been linked to total obedience, and that perhaps this was a mistake. The professor moderated with kindness, repeating his words to the audience for clarity. When it was over, the applause was polite but genuine. Later, one of the American students, a young man preparing to enlist in the Navy, approached him to ask about the German legal tradition. They spoke quietly for 10 minutes until the guards signaled time. It was the first time Weber had spoken with a civilian outside the camp, and it left a deep mark. In his diary that night he wrote, "These people fight not for empire, but for the idea that each man has value." He did not yet know how deeply that sentence would shape his future. In January 1904, as the United States began planning for the invasion of Europe, the War Department approved an expansion of educational programs to reach 50,000 prisoners by year's end. The same ships that carried tanks and guns to England brought back tons of textbooks printed in New York and Chicago for use in the camps. Statistics from that winter show that America spent millions of dollars on prisoner upkeep, yet less than 1% of the captured Germans attempted escape. Observers from the International Red Cross recorded that the prisoners were treated not as labor stock, but as potential partners in a post-war order. The concept of re-education without force had taken root. Inside the barbed wire of a country untouched by bombing, the seeds of a new Europe were being planted. By spring, Weber's English was fluent enough that he could assist the professor during lectures as an informal interpreter for new arrivals. One morning, he stood at the blackboard translating a passage from the Federalist Papers while sunlight fell across the desks. He realized that his accent no longer embarrassed him. The professor, after class, handed him a pamphlet on American constitutional law and said, "When the war ends, you will need this more than we do." Weber carried it back to the truck in silence. On the road through Ruston, he watched the steady traffic of cars and trucks, the warehouses full of goods, the railway switching yards alive with movement. The driver explained that the trains ran day and night, carrying grain, steel, and equipment to the coasts, and that every town was part of that chain. The scale impressed Weber more than any speech could have. He began to see the lectures as reflections of the society out sea. Every concept tied to something real. Freedom linked to abundance, law linked to trust, cooperation linked to progress. When he returned to camp that evening, he saw it through different eyes. The electric lights in each hut, the stocked kitchen, even the orderly distribution of mail seemed to confirm the lessons he was learning in class. Around him, the camp library expanded with new volumes donated by the American Red Cross and local colleges. Newspapers arrived in both English and German, and prisoners discussed articles about the Allied advance in Italy. The tone had changed. There was still loyalty to the homeland, but the old certainty had thinned. Men argued not about victory, but about what would follow defeat. Weber sometimes read aloud from Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man to small groups after evening roll call. The words felt dangerous and yet liberating. He wrote one final line in his notebook before lights out. I begin to understand that education is not a weapon here, but a mirror, and in it we see what we might become. By June 1904, the lectures at Louisiana Polytechnic had evolved into full academic sessions, and Weber was one of the senior students now allowed to attend twice each week. The Allied landings in Normandy were underway, though none of the prisoners knew this until the guards mentioned it days later in hushed tones. The news reached Camp Ruston through American newspapers, not through military briefings. Weber watched the guards reading headlines aloud, their faces half proud and half weary, and realized the world outside the fence was moving toward an end that none of them could see clearly. In the classroom, however, the war felt distant. The professor had introduced new subjects: economics, public administration, and the origins of American law. Each topic built on the last, and Weber's notebooks grew thick with English words written in careful script. The men were still prisoners, yet their routine had taken on the rhythm of academic life. Roll call, meals, lectures, assignments, discussions, and reading hours followed one another with the order of a university term. When the professor announced that the university would begin offering correspondence certificates recognized after the war, a quiet murmur passed through the room. Weber later wrote that he did not expect to live such days again, and that he felt, for the first time since 1940, that the future might hold meaning beyond victory or defeat. On the return drive that afternoon, the truck passed a group of American students waving to them. The guards did not interfere. One of the students shouted, "Good luck, fellas!" And for a brief moment, Weber felt like a man on an exchange program rather than a captive. Across the United States, similar scenes were unfolding in dozens of camps. By the summer of 1944, more than 3,000 Axis prisoners were held in America, spread across 46 states. The number of German officers involved in structured education exceeded 20,000, with many universities now participating officially through the Army Education Service. The University of Minnesota oversaw agricultural courses at nearby camps. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, the German engineers studied American production methods in civilian factories under military supervision. In Nebraska, the State University's Extension Division recorded nearly 2,300 German students in English and mathematics alone. The American public had grown accustomed to the idea that these men were not only laborers, but also students. The newspapers published short stories about them, describing how German prisoners helped harvest wheat in Kansas by day and studied democracy at night. The contrast was powerful propaganda, yet also genuine policy. American leaders understood that the men sitting in those classrooms might one day rebuild Germany, and that their impressions would shape the peace. A report from the War Department that July stated, "The ultimate success of re-education lies not in the indoctrination of the captive, but in his voluntary acceptance of the evident superiority of freedom." In practical terms, this meant more books, more lectures, and greater cooperation with colleges. At Ruston, new professors arrived from Baton Rouge and New Orleans to give guest lectures on economics and public health. Weber listened to a talk on American industrial labor law and was stunned by the idea that workers could strike legally without being executed or imprisoned. He wrote in his diary, "In Germany, such men are shot. Here they are represented." The shock was slow but lasting. Autumn brought change to the camp. The day shortened, and the Louisiana heat gave way to cool mornings filled with fog. Weber now served as interpreter between the university staff and the camp commandant. His English had become fluid enough that he could explain legal terminology to his comrades and translate their questions during class. The professor trusted him and allowed him to read aloud from documents about the Marshall Plan, an initiative still in its earliest planning stage that aimed to rebuild Europe after the war. The Americans were already thinking of Reconstruction while the fighting continued. Weber felt an unease that he could not name. He knew Germany was losing, and he knew that his education under the Americans might someday be the bridge back to a ruined homeland. In November, he received a letter from his mother in Cologne, written under Allied censorship. It spoke of food shortages and of the bombing that had destroyed their street. He read it 3 times that night and folded it carefully into his notebook. The next morning at class, while the professor spoke of civic responsibility, Weber's thoughts drifted to the rubble of his home. He wondered if the very knowledge he was gaining would make him a stranger when he returned. Around him, the other officers sat silent, each absorbed in his own private reckoning. The professor noticed the gloom and began ending lectures with a ritual of sorts, reading short passages from American writers about endurance and rebuilding. The guards sometimes listened as well, and even they seemed subdued. In those late months of 1944, education had become both refuge and reminder. Inside the classroom, there was light and order. Outside, the world was collapsing. In December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge erupted in Europe, the last great German offensive, and the news reached the camp with mixed feelings. Some prisoners cheered quietly, thinking the war might turn again. Others, like Weber, said nothing. He had seen enough of America to know that such a reversal was impossible. That Christmas, the camp authorities permitted a modest celebration. The local Methodist church sent boxes of cookies and cards written by American children. The same university choir that had sung earlier in the year came again to perform carols, this time in German. Weber stood at the back of the hall and listened as they sang Stille Nacht. Tears came to his eyes, not from homesickness alone, but from the recognition that these people, whose country was bombing his own, had shown more kindness than his leaders ever had. Later, during the meal, the professor sat beside him and spoke quietly. "Someday," he said, "you'll teach others what you learned here." Weber nodded, but could not answer. He realized that the war had stripped him of his uniform, his illusions, and even his hatred. And what remained was something fragile and new, like the light on the blackboard when class began each week. The next morning, he walked across the compound before dawn and looked at the horizon beyond the fence. For the first time since his capture, he imagined himself walking freely in Germany again, not as a soldier, but as a student of what he had witnessed in America. The fans above his bunk turned softly, and he wrote one final line before sleeping. "If they can rebuild us with books, then perhaps we deserve another chance." January 1940 brought a colder tone to the camp, though the Louisiana winter remained mild compared to the ice and snow that now covered Europe. Karl Weber had grown leaner, older in the face, but the discipline of study had steadied his spirit. The professors from Louisiana Polytechnic continued their visits even as news of the front lines darkened. The first lecture of the new year was on economics in a post-war world. The professor explained how industrial recovery followed peace, how new credit systems and labor markets could lift nations from ruin. Weber listened with silent intensity. He remembered the shattered streets of Cologne described in his mother's letter, the endless hunger lines, the loss of power and coal. Yet he also remembered the humming factories he had seen from the train on his first journey through America, the steel mills, the stockyards, the vast production that had stunned every captured German soldier. When the professor spoke of rebuilding through cooperation rather than domination, Weber realized he was hearing the quiet foundation of a new Germany being written in theory, before it existed in fact. Later that day, he walked across the compound with a notebook under his arm and felt the strange pull of two worlds, the one he had served and the one he was learning to understand. He wrote that night, "The Americans fight with steel, but they also fight with schools. Perhaps both are stronger than any ideology." While Camp Ruston continued its routine, the American war machine reached its full height. In January 1945, the United States was producing more than 96,000 aircraft per year, over 8 million tons of steel monthly, and feeding not only its own army but those of its allies. The nation had 1,000 universities functioning without interruption, with enrollments climbing even during wartime. Education was part of national identity, not a luxury. Within this system, prisoner re-education was a small but symbolic effort. Reports from the office of the provost Marshal General recorded that 40,000 German prisoners were enrolled in academic programs, with 8,000 in courses directly connected to American universities. Weber and others at Ruston were among the select few granted direct access to faculty and materials. Their lessons ranged from English composition to American constitutional law, from agricultural mechanics to the sociology of democracy. Behind each lecture stood a strategy to demonstrate through daily example that a free society could maintain order without terror. The Americans called it the demonstration effect. For the prisoners, it was proof that authority could function without cruelty. The Red Cross inspectors who toured Camp Ruston in February noted the remarkable civility between guards and the prisoners. They wrote that education, more than discipline, maintained peace. Weber found the same to be true. When small quarrels arose in the barracks, he and the other student officers settled them by discussion rather than command. Something had shifted inside the camp itself, as if the habits of the classroom were remaking the habits of captivity. In March, Louisiana Polytechnic held a modest ceremony for the first group of prisoners to complete correspondence courses. 10 men received papers confirming their successful study in English and civics. They were not diplomas in the formal sense, but the professor presented them with genuine pride, saying that learning amid confinement was an act of courage The university arranged for the local newspaper to report the story, and the article appeared under the headline, "German Prisoners Complete College Study." The townspeople's reaction was mixed. Some objected that the enemy deserved only work, not education. Others saw it as proof of America's moral superiority. For the prisoners, it meant something quieter and deeper. Weber folded his certificate carefully into his diary and wrote, "They teach us so we may carry knowledge home, perhaps as peace." Around that time, rumors spread through the camp that Germany was near collapse. American guards spoke of Allied forces closing in on the Rhine. Letters from home grew fewer, shorter, and more desperate. Yet classes continued. The professor began a new lecture series on the reconstruction of Europe after 1918, using it as a lesson in the dangers of vindictive peace. He read aloud from Woodrow Wilson's 14 Points and described how the failure to uphold them had led to another war. Weber listened and felt the weight of the subject. When asked to summarize the day's lesson, he replied simply, "Peace must be built like a bridge, not forced like a wall." The professor smiled and said that was a very American sentence. By April 1940, news reached Camp Ruston that President Roosevelt had died. The announcement came at roll call, and for a long moment, the entire camp, guards and prisoners alike, stood in silence. Many prisoners, including Weber, had grown to associate Roosevelt's name with the nation that had fed, clothed, and educated them despite war. The professor arrived that afternoon visibly shaken. He began class by saying that democracies survive not through one man, but through institutions and faith in the people. Weber watched him struggle to continue, and he felt a human closeness that erased all remaining enmity. A week later, word spread of the fall of Berlin. The guards made no speeches, but the reality hung in the air. Germany was finished. The classroom turned somber. The men knew that soon they would be sent home to a land in ruins. The professor spoke softly, urging them to remember what they had seen. "You have lived inside another system," he said. "Take what you have learned here and use it well. You may be the first builders of a new Germany." On the night of April 30th, Weber sat on his bunk, listening to the sound of insects outside the window, and wrote one last entry before the camp lights went out. "The war that began with orders has ended with the lessons. I have been conquered not by armies, but by ideas." May 1840 arrived with the surrender of Germany. The camp loudspeaker announced it in 2 languages. At first there was no sound, only a quiet murmur as hundreds of men stood motionless in the morning sun. Some removed their caps, others looked down at the dust under their boots. The guards did not celebrate. They stood at ease, rifles resting against their shoulders, aware that the moment was both victory and burden. Karl Weber sat on a wooden bench near the wire fence and felt neither relief nor despair, only a deep exhaustion. The professor came later that afternoon wearing his best suit, though his voice trembled. "The war in Europe is over," he said simply. "Now begins the work that lasts longer than war." He looked across the room at the German officers who had attended his classes for 2 years. "You are no longer soldiers. You are witnesses." Weber wrote those words in his notebook and closed it. That evening, As lights came on across the camp, he saw the glow stretch beyond the fence to the town. It was the same light that had shocked him on his first night in America, the light that had seemed like an endless constellation of power. Now, it no longer mocked him, it guided him. He understood that the education they had received had not been an act of mercy alone, but preparation for something greater. In June, American officials from Washington arrived at Camp Ruston to oversee what they called the Transition Program. They carried folders stamped Reorientation Division, part of the broader plan to prepare prisoners for eventual repatriation. The officers explained that the most cooperative and educated men would be given new courses in history, economics, and democratic institutions to serve as multipliers when they returned to Germany. Weber was among those selected. The classes were longer, more demanding, and often held in English only. The curriculum drew from American university materials, documents from the University of Chicago, Stanford, and Columbia. The subjects ranged from constitutional development to industrial management. Each lesson revealed more of how the American system functioned, its checks, its contradictions, its ability to correct itself through open debate. Weber found himself fascinated not only by the information, but by the attitude of inquiry. Students could question, even challenge the lecturer, without punishment. This freedom of doubt was new to him. He realized that his old training as an officer had been built on obedience, not understanding. In these rooms, truth was pursued by reason, not decreed by authority. Outside the war's aftermath was visible even in America. Newspaper headlines spoke of bombed cities, displaced millions, and the discovery of concentration camps. The photographs were displayed in the camp library. Weber stared at them in silence for hours. He felt his stomach tighten, his mind numb. The professor did not comment. He only said quietly, "Now you see why education matters." By August 1945, the world had changed again. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought an end to the war in the Pacific. In Camp Ruston, the prisoners read about it in the newspapers delivered each morning. Some were horrified, others simply bewildered by the scale of destruction. The guards seemed subdued. Weber sensed that even victory could terrify. Yet for him, the larger revelation was how quickly America turned from war to reconstruction. Factories that had built bombers were already converting to produce tractors, engines, and machinery for civilian life. The university expanded its night programs for returning veterans under a new law called the GI Base Bill, and the professor explained that millions of American soldiers would now attend college with government support. Weber thought about the contrast. In Germany, universities had been stripped for ideology. Here, education was treated as a reward for service. He wrote in his journal, "They rebuild through knowledge, not conquest." Around that time, the camp reorientation courses introduced discussions on the future of Europe. American officers lectured about something called the Marshall Plan, though its name had not yet become official. They described a vision of shared rebuilding and open trade. Weber listened, aware that he was hearing the blueprint of the next world order while still behind wire. When the lecture ended, the professor said, "This is what you must carry home. Not hatred, but this. As autumn came, the repatriation lists began to circulate. Men who had been prisoners for years would soon be returned to Germany in stages. Before departure, they attended interviews to assess their readiness to adapt to democratic life. Weber passed his evaluation easily. The American officer noted his grasp of English and his calm demeanor. "You'll be useful in the reconstruction," the officer said. On his last day at Louisiana Polytechnic, the professor handed him a sealed envelope containing a letter of recommendation addressed to any European university. "You were my student," he said, shaking Weber's hand. "Never forget that learning can rebuild what politics destroys." The next morning, Weber boarded a train with hundreds of other men bound for the East Coast. As the wheels began to turn, he looked out at the receding camp, the pine trees, and the distant water tower of Ruston. He thought of the first day he had seen this place, when he believed captivity would break him. Instead, it had reared him. The train rolled eastward through a landscape bright with factories, bridges, and rail yards, each one alive with power. He understood now that these were not just signs of wealth, but of a civilization built on shared purpose. In his notebook, he wrote one final sentence before closing it for good. "They taught us freedom by living it." December 1940. The Atlantic wind was sharp and cold as the ship approached the German coast. After nearly 3 years in America, Karl Weber stood at the rail and stared toward the gray line of land that rose slowly out of the mist. Around him, hundreds of former officers crowded the deck, their breath visible in the freezing air. The ship carried them from Norfolk to Le Havre, then onward by train through France and into the American zone of occupation. Weber had packed little. His few notebooks, a handful of letters, and the professor's recommendation were all that remained of his time in captivity. He had read the letter again during the voyage. It was brief but powerful. This student demonstrated integrity, reason, and an understanding of civic responsibility. I recommend him for further study in any institution devoted to the reconstruction of Europe. He folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. As the ship neared port, the men around him began to sing softly. It was not a military song, but an old folk tune from the Rhine Valley. The sound was weary yet human. Weber closed his eyes and let it carry him back to a time before uniforms and orders, when he had been a young man studying law at Bonn, still believing the future could be shaped by books rather than weapons. The first sight of Germany broke his composure. The harbor cranes stood motionless. Many toppled or rusted. Warehouses were burned-out shells. The railway lands beyond the docks twisted like broken wire. He could smell smoke even in the winter air. Allied soldiers directed the prisoners through a checkpoint with quiet efficiency. There were no jeers, only the dull rhythm of boots on planks and the rustle of papers being checked. From Le Havre, they were transported through shattered towns where only church spires and chimneys remained standing. The silence of the ruined cities pressed against the train windows like a weight. In Cologne, Weber caught sight of what had once been his neighborhood, a field of rubble, half-buried tram rails, the skeletal remains of an apartment block. The cathedral still stood, blackened but whole, its twin towers rising over the destruction. He felt tears fill his eyes. but said nothing. At a reception center near Koblenz, American officers processed the returning prisoners. They asked questions not about the past war, but about the future. Could they work? Could they teach? Would they support democracy in a new Germany? Weber answered each calmly. When asked his profession, he said, "Law student." The officer nodded and marked his form, then told him about a new program being discussed between the occupying authorities and German educators. Universities reopening under supervision to train administrators, teachers, and engineers. It was the first concrete sign that learning would once again shape the country's fate. By early 1946, the ruins of Germany had begun to stir with hesitant movement. Food was scarce, housing nearly non-existent. Yet classes were resuming in halls with shattered windows. Weber found his way to the University of Göttingen, one of the first to reopen under British and American oversight. The corridors were unheated, the blackboards cracked, but the rooms were full of men and women who had survived the war and were now determined to rebuild knowledge from ashes. The rector welcomed him after reading the letter from Louisiana. "So, you were one of the American students," he said with a faint smile. "Then you already understand more about the coming world than most of us." Weber began assisting in courses on comparative law, translating English legal materials provided by the Allied Education Control Office. Many of the texts bore university seals from Chicago and Yale, the same institutions that had once guided the camp curriculum. The parallels struck him with force. He recognized the same structure, the same tone, even the same footnotes. The Americans had not only trained him, they had prepared Germany's return to lawful civilization through the spread of academic method. In the evenings, he taught English to younger students in exchange for bread and coffee. His notebooks from Camp Ruston became their first textbooks. He wrote in one margin, "From captivity to classroom, the same purpose continues to learn freedom." By 1947, re-education had shifted from experiment to policy. The Allied High Commission supported scholarships for former prisoners who had distinguished themselves in American camps. Some were invited back to the United States under cultural exchange programs to study agriculture, engineering, or economics. Weber was among those selected. He received a letter from the American consulate in Frankfurt offering a place in a visiting scholars seminar at Columbia University. The letter called it the Reorientation Fellowship. He stood for a long time reading it beneath the flickering light of a rebuilt station platform. The war had destroyed his homeland, but had also opened a path he could never have imagined. A path from soldier to student, from conquered enemy to invited guest. When he arrived in New York that autumn, the skyline glittered with the very light he had first seen across the Texas plains. Columbia's campus felt both foreign and familiar. The same language, the same discipline, the same belief in reason over fear. During a seminar on comparative constitutions, Weber spoke about the lessons of Camp Ruston. Education did what armies could not, he told the class. It turned enemies into partners. The room fell silent, and then the professor nodded slowly. "Perhaps that," he said, "was our greatest victory